Good afternoon and welcome everyone. Today's session is 2 years in. Lessons learned with the pregnancy and lactation labeling rule. So the objectives of this session are to share agency's key considerations for PLLR labeling conversion, including human data considerations when data are inconclusive, also on when to include labeling recommendations for pregnancy testing and contraception. We also have industry perspective on complying with the PLLR in recent years, including how the approach to PLLR labeling, creation, and conversion has evolved, challenges faced, and learnings. I will provide a brief introduction, and then we'll turn it over to Dr. Miriam Dinatale for approaches to human data. Then Dr. Jane Liedtka will continue with considerations, and we will then have Dr. Tracy Lee finish off with industry perspective and learnings. Presentations will follow with a panel session, so I ask that everyone hold their questions until that time. So it's been 2 years of PLLR implementation. I'm just going to go through a quick review. There's a standard disclaimer. The opinions expressed in this presentation are my own and do not necessarily represent an official position of the agency. I serve as a lead medical officer within the Division of Pediatric and Maternal Health. We are located within Office of New Drug, CDER, FDA. We're comprised of a maternal health team, a pediatric team, and a regulatory team. The slide is in error. Our regulatory team supports both the maternal and pediatrics team. And our mission is to develop clinically relevant, evidence-based labeling and other communications that facilitate informed use of medicines in children and females of reproductive potential. Our role with PLLR is that we provide consultation to review divisions within the agency on issues related to maternal health, that is pregnancy and lactation. We collaborate within the agency to provide a consistency of the process in implementing PLLR, and that includes coordinating revisions to the draft PLLR guidance, of which we are still going through comments. We are tracking drug product labeling compliance with the PLLR requirement. And lastly, we participate in events like this to raise awareness about the PLLR to external stakeholders. So some of you may have seen this table before. I'm just going to go through for a review piece by piece. The PLLR became effective on June 30th, 2015. And subsequent to that, all new NDAs, BLAs, and efficacy supplements must comply upon submission with the content and format requirements of PLLR. This does include 505(b)(2)s and biosimilars. This next group are those applications that have been approved after June 30th, 2001 and before June 30th, 2015. You'll see they're divided into 3 groupings or cohorts, if you may, where products would either need to comply with the PLLR requirement by June 2018, 2019, or 2020. I do want to point out that when you consider the submission date, that you go with the earliest required submission date. For example, if your product was approved in 2004, you would not, if it was approved in 2004 but then had an efficacy supplement that was then approved in 2006, you would choose June 30th, 2018 as the date that you submit your PLLR labeling. And lastly, we have those products for which were approved prior to June 30th, 2015. They remain in the old labeling format. They're not required to be in PLLR. However, to comply with PLLR, they need to remove their pregnancy letter category by June 30th, 2018. A little bit more about these products. They were approved prior to June 30th, 2001. They have had no further efficacy supplements approved, and they have not voluntarily converted to the physician's labeling rule. They have to comply and remove the category by June 30th, 2018. However, those standard statements associated with the categories must remain in labeling. And for all applications, it is important to review if the existing data and recommendations in the labeling are accurate and up to date. So just to give you a quick look at where we are, it's been 2 years. We've had over 500 labels converted to PLLR format. This does not include, we have not counted the generic conversions that may have followed. We anticipate for the future cohorts that we would see in 2018, maybe about 400, that doubles by 2019, and then we start to come down in 2020. Okay, and with that, I'm going to turn over to Dr. Dinatale.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Johnson. So good afternoon. I'm going to be looking at the approaches to human data. My standard disclaimer. Okay, so as an introduction, we'll start with an introduction. I'll review the draft PLLR guidance regarding human data. Then we'll look at some current approaches to the inclusion of human data and labeling, and then I'll provide you with a conclusion. So human data about medical product safety and pregnancy at the time of market approval is usually limited or absent. Women who become pregnant are usually excluded from clinical trials, and women who become pregnant during clinical trials are discontinued or followed. Consequently, almost all of the clinically relevant human data are collected post-approval. So the important goal of PLLR conversion process is to have accurate and up-to-date labeling recommendations that reflect the post-approval experience. So here are some human data sources for pregnancy. So data can come from clinical trials that are specific for pregnancy-related conditions. Perhaps you have an inadvertent pregnancy that was reported in a clinical trial for a non-pregnancy-related condition. And then you have observational studies, so a pregnancy exposure registry, maybe a cohort study or a case control study, enhanced pregnancy surveillance programs, and then maybe case reports or case series. So let's take a look at the draft PLLR guidance regarding the inclusion of human data in subsection 8.1. So the draft guidance notes that if you are going to include a human data section, it should include the following elements. What is the source of the data? Do you have a controlled trial? Maybe you have another epidemiologic or surveillance study? How many subjects were included? How long did the study last? What exposure information do you have? Maybe the timing, duration, dose of exposure, and then what are the limitations for the data? Include potential confounders and biases if they're known. And if available, also include data from the comparator control groups, as well as data confidence intervals or power calculations. So here are some of the challenges. Most of the human data that we have related to use of a drug during pregnancy or lactation does not come from an adequate or well-controlled trial. So the FDA has been having ongoing discussions about what we do when the data are limited, when there is a lack of specific or consistent safety finding, and whether or not we should be including case reports. So here's our current approach to the inclusion of human data in subsection 8.1. And I'd like to go through some key considerations with you. The first thing to consider is, what is the quantity of the data? You have no data. Perhaps you have limited data. Maybe you have a small number of case reports, but there's no safety signal. Or maybe you have case reports where there's missing information or confounding. So in this case, that you can't make a conclusion about the adverse developmental outcomes. Perhaps you have more extensive data. Maybe you have information from a pregnancy exposure registry. In this case, it doesn't necessarily establish or exclude the absence of the risk. The goal here is not to have a detailed description of every study, but to have a general conclusion about the safety message is what is most valuable. Next thing, consider the quality of the data. You have relevant detailed information. What's the design of the study? Do you just have case reports or series, or do you have observational studies? Look at the consistency or the pattern of the outcomes. Are the human pregnancy outcomes consistent with what has been seen in animal studies? Are human pregnancy outcomes consistent among other human studies? And then consider the impact. Is there any impact on safety? If there's no impact to safety, then perhaps a risk summary statement would be sufficient, and you won't necessarily need to include any information under human data. If there is a trigger to a change in safety message, then that would be something to consider putting under human data. So I'm going to walk you through some different examples of how we have approached labeling based on those key considerations. So first to consider is, what if you have no data with no impact to safety? Often this would include things like new molecular entities or new biologics license applications. Here's an example of what labeling might look like in that situation. The risk summary would state something like this: there are no available data on trade name use in pregnant women to inform a drug-associated risk of adverse developmental outcomes. So what if instead you have some data, but still no safety impact? So for example, maybe you have some case reports with some sparse details from a clinical development program. Perhaps you have a moderate number of case reports, but no patterns or consistencies that have been seen. And this might include NMEs or BLAs, maybe some rare disease drugs or newly marketed drugs. And here's what labeling might look like. Under risk summary, you may see something like this: limited available data with trade name use in pregnant women are insufficient to inform the drug-associated risk. Okay, so let's take this one step up. What if you have more data, still no impact to safety, but no consistency to the findings? So perhaps you have data that comes from a large epidemiologic study that has no clear association of adverse outcomes. It doesn't necessarily establish or exclude the absence of a risk. And again, the goal is not to have a detailed description of every single study, but to have a general conclusion about the safety message. The situation may also only include some simple statements under risk summary and data. And then any further description of the data should be balanced about what is meaningful to the prescriber. So here's the example. So this is a situation of a drug that has a combination. And then, so there's little information known with the combination product and one of the components. And there's more information about the second component. So here's how we did this. Risk summary stated that there are limited data with the trade name and the drug name in the pregnant women. And then at the end, we mentioned that there are published studies with that second component of the product when used in pregnancy, but it has not reported a clear association with that drug name and any adverse pregnancy outcomes. And then there's a reference to the data section where more information is provided. So under the human data section, again, we noted that these are published data from post-marketing studies, that there was no clear association of that particular drug name and those adverse pregnancy outcomes listed here, and that we cannot definitively establish the absence of risk because these particular studies have several methodologic limitations, and then we include what those limitations are. So let's take this one step further. What if now you have more quality data? There's a potential impact to safety, but the findings are inconsistent. So perhaps you have some varied finding from large epidemiologic studies, where you have some studies that report a potential risk and others that have no association. So no consistency or pattern. In this case, those details would be reported under the human data section. So for this particular example that I'm going to show you, this drug had 2 large retrospective cohort studies that looked at this drug use during pregnancy. One of those studies had no adverse effects seen, no congenital malformations, and the second study showed a potential association with cardiac malformations. There was also one case control study that had a finding of isolated cleft palate, and then there were several smaller observational studies that had no adverse outcomes, but also had many limitations. So this is how we approached that labeling. Under risk summary, we noted that there are available data that do not reliably inform the association of this product with adverse pregnancy outcomes. And then we note that there are published epidemiologic studies that have reported these inconsistent findings, but also have these methodologic limitations that hinder the interpretation. And then we refer the prescriber to the data section for more information. Under the human data section, we have details about those 2 retrospective studies. So this one discusses that first retrospective study. It includes the number of patients that were included. The finding that was included in this case was the cardiovascular malformations. The second part looks at that second retrospective study. Again, the number of women who were included. And in this case, there was no association reported between the drug exposure and adverse pregnancy outcomes. And finally, there was a brief description of the case control study that was done that showed the isolated case of cleft palate. Okay, so let's look at another situation. What if you have quality data with a clearly identified safety finding? So perhaps you have case reports that have quality information that reasonably determines a risk, especially when the finding is rare. Perhaps you have a pregnancy registry or other quality epidemiologic study that reports a specific increased finding. In this case, those details would be reported under human data. So the example that I'm going to show you here is of a product that when it was initially approved, all that we had were animal data. And those data did not show any adverse findings in the fetus. However, when the drug was introduced, post-marketing reports showed an increased incidence of oligohydramnios. And this is how we approach the risk summary for that product. We noted that this product can cause an increase in fetal harm, and that there were post-marketing reports that demonstrated the cases of oligohydramnios. And then we refer the prescriber to the data section where more details were provided. Under human data, again, we do further description of those studies. For this particular product, when women were taken off of the product, the amniotic fluid index increased. And when the product was restarted, the amniotic fluid index decreased. So oligohydramnios recurred. Okay, so a little bit about pregnancy exposure registries. These may be required by the FDA to collect more information on the risk of adverse events in pregnancies exposed to certain drugs. And usually it's designed to assess the risk of an adverse pregnancy outcome. The advantage of the pregnancy registry are these are prospective assessments of outcomes that occur during or after pregnancy. They have the ability to rule out a major teratogen, and they're helpful to help develop a hypothesis. The problem with pregnancy registries are there are low numbers. Enrollment tends to be low. There's selection bias due to timing of enrollment and voluntary enrollment, and limited ability for confounding adjustment. So here's an example of labeling where we included the results of a pregnancy exposure registry. So this is a particular registry that is a product that is used for rheumatoid arthritis and Crohn's disease. And here's how we approached risk summary. So we noted that there were limited clinical data that are available from this pregnancy registry. We also noted the rates of fetal malformations that were seen with first trimester use of the drug, and then also provided the rates of the fetal malformations that were seen in the comparator groups. And then under human data, we provide more information. We note that it's a prospective cohort study. We note where it was conducted, the years that it was conducted, and the number of subjects that were included in each of the groups. And again, we provide a rate of the fetal malformations that were seen. We also note that the study cannot definitively establish the absence of risk because of methodologic limitations. And in this situation, the sample size was small, and the study was not a randomized study. As I mentioned, the study also includes Crohn's disease portion, and at the time of this labeling, that part of the study was still ongoing. So let's turn our attention to subsection 8.2, lactation. And we'll start by taking a look at the draft guidance. So the draft guidance notes that when we have relevant human or animal data that are available, information should be presented in risk summary and could also include a data section. The data can come from a clinical lactation study or from other sources if there's a published clinical lactation study or other lactation databases. And then it is important for the applicant to evaluate the quality and the quantity of this data to make sure that this is information that warrants inclusion in labeling. The problem with lactation is that we have even less clinical data than we do with pregnancy. Published clinical studies aren't always of the best quality. Often we don't have any information about the effects of the drug on the breastfed infant. And we don't always have the raw data for review. So in this situation, there's a greater contribution on the case reports to determine risk. So in terms of the data section, this is included only when the information are available. So for example, if you have a clinical lactation study, this information may be included here. Or if there are no human data, then you can consider the inclusion of animal lactation information under this section. So let me provide you with an example. This first example is of a product where all we had were case reports. And this information is summarized here under risk summary. We note that there are limited data from the case reports in published literature. We note that the drug is present, and then also include the relative infant dose at which the drug is present. And then we note that there's no effects of the drug on the breastfed infant or on milk production. And then we include the risk-benefit statement that is included when there is no concern with using the drug during lactation. The second example is of a product where we have a pharmacokinetic study that was done in lactating women. So under this risk summary, we have a brief summary of that study, and then we refer the prescriber to the data section where more details are included. So here's where the details of the PK study are included. We note, again, the number of women that were included in the study, how far along they were postpartum, and what was looked at. They looked at the concentrations of the drug in the plasma and breast milk, and also noting how much of the drug the woman was given. And then there's more information about the estimated average daily infant dose that is included. So in conclusion, the goal of PLLR is to accurately communicate information that is known about the risk with a prescription drug use in a pregnant or lactating woman. PLLR format improves the information of currently available information, but it doesn't always help when the data are of poor quality or sparse. The determination of the adequate data is based on the clinical review, and it's important to have the applicant's input to determine what information warrants inclusion and the rationale for including different updates of safety. And the FDA continues to think about how to include human data into labeling that is both accurate and meaningful to the prescriber. Thank you for your attention. At this time, I'll introduce Dr. Jane Liedtka.
Good afternoon. So I'm going to talk to you today about further considerations for PLLR. The usual disclaimer. So we're going to start by discussing the process, and then talk further about the content, followed by only a briefly touching on the format, and then finally we'll summarize. So we'd like the submitted labeling for PLLR to be compliant with the PLLR format. It should reflect an integrated assessment of known risks relevant to pregnancy, lactation, and fertility based on available information. It should be accompanied by a summary and a review of the available information that supports the labeling content. And all of this should be included in Module 1 of the submission. We'd like applicants to be aware of the need for PLLR format and that it includes new 505(b)(2) applications and biosimilar applications. We're trying to inform as many applicants as possible through external conferences such as this one, through the FDA website, and also through pre-BLA and pre-NDA meetings. You should be aware that there will be no waivers of the PLLR requirement. Deferral requests will be reviewed on a case-by-case basis, and this is a potential refuse to file issue. If the submission lacks the required supporting information for PLLR, it's usually not going to be grounds alone for a refuse to file. In most cases, the division will issue an information request. The applicant should consider the amount of supporting information that needs to be prepared and the time that's needed to respond to this IR. Keeping in mind that response to an IR, if the response is large, could be considered a major amendment, and that could potentially affect the review clock. So what supportive information do we want to see? We want a review and a summary of available non-clinical information, including published literature. This is particularly important for older drugs where the original non-clinical studies may have been performed at an earlier date and may not be considered adequate by today's standards. We also want a review and summary of available published literature regarding use of the drug in pregnant and lactating women and effects of the drug on male and female fertility. We'd like you to include your search parameters and include a copy of each reference publication in the submission. We'd like a cumulative review and summary of relevant cases reported in your pharmacovigilance database, and this should be from the time of product development to the present. We'd also like to see drug utilization rates among females of reproductive potential, and this would usually be considered women between the ages of 15 to 44, and these should be calculated cumulatively since the initial approval. If there's a pregnancy registry, we'd like to see either an interim report from an ongoing one or a final report from one that's been closed. So let's move on to content considerations, and we're going to start with clinical considerations. One of the subheadings for this heading is disease-associated maternal and/or embryo-fetal risk. What we do not want is an exhaustive textbook description of the untreated disease and its effect on pregnancy outcomes. We would like a brief description with limited information about well-established known or potential risks of the underlying disease on the pregnancy outcomes. And here's an example. This one is for a diabetes drug, and essentially it reports what the increased risks are for the maternal side and also for the fetal side. And you're going to have copies of all these slides, so I won't necessarily read all the details. Moving on to content for lactation. It's already been touched upon that there is a standard risk-benefit statement that we use when there's nothing to say that we don't want you to breastfeed. However, that required risk-benefit statement can be omitted if breastfeeding is not recommended. Here's an example of that situation. This is for an HIV drug. And in the risk summary, basically it reports that the CDC recommends against breastfeeding for HIV mothers, positive mothers, and that this is based on concerns about transmission of HIV, developing viral resistance, and serious adverse reactions. Moving on to section 8.3, females and males of reproductive potential. There are multiple potential subheadings in this category, including pregnancy testing, contraception, and infertility, and they could be used as needed depending on the drug. The intent for pregnancy testing is to determine the woman's status in time to prevent or at least to minimize embryo-fetal exposure to a drug that has either known or suspected embryo-fetal toxicity. If that's the case, Section 2, Dosage and Administration, should also identify any specific safety monitoring procedure that should be implemented. This would include ruling out pregnancy for an embryo-fetal toxic drug. In most cases, when embryo-fetal toxicity is present and there are recommendations for pregnancy testing and contraception, there will also be a warning and precaution, including in labeling. Now, moving on to contraception, the intent is to, again, prevent embryo-fetal exposure. If there are drug interactions that require the use of alternative methods of contraception, that would be included under this section, and then it would also be cross-referenced to Section 7, drug interactions. So here's an example of Section 8.3 for a drug that has known or suspected embryo-fetal toxicity. Under pregnancy testing, you're requested to verify the pregnancy status. And in contraception section under females, it notes that based on the mechanism of action and the animal data, it's possible that the drug can cause fetal harm and that women are advised to use effective contraception. Here's an example of some language that might be used in the males section under contraception for a drug that's present in semen. Generally, it will note that it is not known if the amount of drug that's present in semen can cause embryo-fetal harm, but it advises male patients to use a condom and also advises against donating semen during treatment. Here's an example of language for when there are drug contraceptive interactions. Again, under contraception, it would be noted that the drug can reduce the efficacy of hormonal contraceptives, and it advises patients to use an alternative method. Under the fertility section, this can again be divided up into males and females. Based on findings from animal studies, female fertility may be compromised. And then in the male section, based on animal studies, trade name can lead to an inhibition of spermatogenesis and may impair fertility. And then it notes that the long-term effects have not been studied. Very briefly, to talk about format, it's important that the subheadings and headings within sections should be consistent throughout labeling. It's also important to realize that for combination products, you want to address the combination, but you also want to address what is known about each individual component. So here's an example of a risk summary for a combination product. First, there's the statement that there is no available data with the trade name, the combination, or component 1 or component 2 to inform a drug-associated risk. But then it goes on to note that for component 1, the following animal data is available. The risk summary continues with information that's available from animal data about component 2, and then finishes off with our standard estimated background risk statement. For the animal data section for this particular drug, there was no animal data for the combination. And so it was basically listed what was known under component 1 and what was known under component 2. So in summary, we want the submitted labeling to comply with PLLR requirements and be accompanied by a summary and a review of available relevant information. Additional places you can look for recommendations would be the draft guidance for industry, the selected requirements for prescribing information, and also take a look at recent PLLR conversions that are for drugs from the same class or drugs where you had a similar patient population, and they can be a guide. Here are links to the previously mentioned draft guidance, also a link to the final rule, and a link to the physician labeling rule. And then finally, here are a number of links to very useful places to go to look for more information. FDA label is relatively new, and it's a full text search. Drugs at FDA, I'm sure most of you are already familiar with, Daily Med, LACMed, the CDC site, and then finally our FDA Office of Women's Health website. And again, you'll get copies of these, so you'll have copies of all these links. Thank you. Green light on?
Can you hear me now? There we go. Okay. Okay, thanks, Jane. Thanks for setting this up for the industry perspective. So again, I'm Tracy Lee. I work at GlaxoSmithKline. I've been working on the PLLR initiative for a couple of years now. I'm excited to speak with you today. First, a poll for the folks here in the audience. By a show of hands, can you raise your hand if you've worked on a PLLR label, either converted one or did a new one? Okay, great. So a lot of great experience in this room. I hope to add a little bit more experience today to consider. So my, oh, I don't have this clicker. That would help. So this is just to note that these are my personal opinions, not FDA's and not GSK's. So I'm going to talk about our approach to PLLR and how we managed that over the past couple of years, labeling's role in that within the company, FDA feedback that we've received, challenges that we face that other sponsors may face, and then also some learnings. And then a small minor objective of my own is to not say PLR when I mean to say PLLR, because those acronyms are kind of confusing. Okay, so initially we established a PLLR subteam dedicated to this initiative. It included labeling, non-clinical, safety, epidemiology, and clinical pharmacology isn't on that list, but they were certainly included as well. We created training materials to do some broad distribution within the company. We created slides, we created standard emails, we sent those out to the relevant groups. And another thing to point out here, those the sub-team members, we were always giving them the direct contacts to those different disciplines, so they felt like they had a direct point of contact of someone to reach to have consistent information. So I don't expect you to read this schematic in full because obviously it's very small, but I want to point out, again, the disciplines in the right-hand column. And this just kind of set up the stage for who's going to actually have to take some action. And then the second column of boxes kind of summarizes what actions would need to be taken. And then this is the flow that would happen throughout the company to make sure we're meeting the requirements. So because these, the update to the label impacts safety sections, we had to propose our plan to upper management, and then we needed to gain safety board approval to make sure we were addressing the issues and also making sure we didn't have any impact or concern about how we were addressing those issues. Because GSK has a very extensive mature product portfolio, we have more than 80 US labels. We really needed to assess the timelines over time and make sure we weren't just giving boluses of those 3 yearly dates that Dr. Johnson mentioned in 2018, 2019, and 2020. If that had been the case, we would have had 46 labels to submit in 2019 in 1 month. And from a resource perspective, that was not going to happen. So what we did, we assigned alternative staggered timelines from the very beginning by quarter. And that was based on when we had upcoming efficacy supplements and also just workload for different therapy areas and what made sense to batch things together over time. Once we had a plan of how we were going to complete these conversions over time, we needed to make sure that we had an established internal review process to aid consistency, to share learnings across different therapy areas, to make sure there was that crosstalk, and to also track the learnings that we received as we made submissions and got feedback. So beyond the project teams doing their updates, we had 2 other levels of review. One was 2 labeling people, myself and another person, reviewed all the PLLR labels that occurred just to, again, have that broad perspective and see if we could add some value to the content changes the project team had made that they may not be aware of happening in other therapy areas. And then independent of the regulation, GSK previously had a pregnancy outcomes advisory panel. This was a panel internally made up of clinicians, OBGYN clinicians, non-clinical specialists, and epidemiologists, who was a resource for project teams who had questions about inclusion of females of reproductive potential in trials, contraceptive measures, that sort of thing. But since we had this already established, we took an opportunity to have this group review all the PLLR labels coming through. Almost missed that. So we really ended up with 3 levels of review: the project team, the additional labeling review, and then this pregnancy outcome panel that I mentioned. So labeling's role, we obviously needed to kind of spearhead it. We needed to identify the functional experts for each of the products assigned and kick off team meetings to explain that process. I would just recommend to do that well in advance of the regulatory timings or the timings that you've specified internally. It always takes longer than you think. I've learned with labeling updates. We rolled out those timings to the individual teams, then outlined the product support that we needed. And I just want to emphasize there was a lot of education. I mentioned at the beginning there was a rollout of emails and presentations, but as time passes, if people don't use it, they lose it. So there was a lot of more education when you did these kickoff teams, both in the team setting and also one-on-one. So labeling wanted to ensure we were compliant with the new regulation, that we were following the draft guidance, and then we also wanted to collect GSK experiences and share those learnings, as I mentioned before. As a part of that, early on, it was more difficult to do because there weren't a lot of labels approved, but as Dr. Johnson mentioned, there's been many now, so it's much easier to benchmark, looking through Daily Med and looking at other classes, improved indications, to get some of that standard language that's been accepted. I'm going to move on to some submission topics here. So after we did a few submissions, it became really clear that we needed a standardized template as a supporting document to submit along with the updated labeling. So this template was created to align to all the sections of the label that would be updated, 8.1, 8.2, 8.3, and 13.1 if that applied. Dr. Liedtka mentioned that this would be submitted in Module 1. So we've had some success with submitting this in the recent year. And the other thing this did is it drove, it has in there the searching algorithms or strategies for teams. So safety and epidemiology were searching the same terminology in the published literature to, again, aid that consistency. And then finally, when I think it gave them kind of more involvement in writing the support, because if labeling is writing an update and you ask them to review a section of the label and they give you comments back, that's one thing. But if you ask them to write a section of the supporting document to support what you've updated in the label, it just adds a new dynamic or element of support. So we haven't gotten any direct feedback from FDA on this template, but I think it's been a really good tool internally for GSK. So this I alluded to before in terms of labeling's role. We wanted to analyze the feedback we received, apply the learnings to other labels, share them with internal stakeholders. So we would do this in the context of labeling meetings that we had with just the labeling strategy folks and share what we've seen, what got approved, so we could apply it to other labels. And then when things were approved, also before it was approved, we would consider the company core safety information if anything changed. And then obviously after it was approved, we'd have to look at that again and see if there was any impact with the new data being added. So just in terms of insights from FDA, I've broken this down. Again, this is just GSK's experience, and I've broken this down into clinical and non-clinical sections. And I think Dr. Dinatale referred to this as well. Like, the data needs to be robust. It needs to be qualitative, not quantitative. And Anne-Marie said yesterday, the labeling is not the place where you put everything. It needs to be focused and limited. So a lot of times clinicians in the company felt like, well, this is our opportunity to describe everything around pregnancy. And the labeling is not the source to do that. So the data needs to be evaluated from that perspective. And we would have to put on our labeling hat and say, this is not necessarily appropriate for labeling. Because of that, there ended up being limited clinical information accepted in the clinical considerations section. We tended to propose more and be broader, more conservative, and then when FDA had a view on it, obviously it streamlined a bit. And then we were able to adopt some class language. For example, when we got an asthma label approved, we were able to use some of those maternal and neonatal outcomes in that population into our other asthma labels. So that was helpful to have that history. From a non-clinical perspective, it was slightly different. We saw some varying types of responses. We had taken the opportunity to revise how the animal data was presented and more in line with the draft guidance in characterizing the data, for example, changing the multiple exposures based on AUC or Cmax versus body surface area, and then also noting the outcomes, whether or not they were in the presence or absence of maternal toxicity. And what we saw in several cases is where FDA reverted back to the original presentation of the non-clinical text, or reverted the exposure calculations back, or removed the maternal toxicity information. My personal sense is a lot of that was based on timing of review and them not having enough time to adequately do a complete review to make all the changes. But I'm hoping that will change over time as the group gets more comfortable with reviewing these types of updates. Additional feedback. In the lactation section, we heard about the required statement, the risk-benefit statement, and how it could be omitted in the case where breastfeeding is not recommended. But we actually had situations where it was removed just like unexpectedly, it was being removed. And then the animal lactation data, we would have a statement in the risk summary, and then in the animal data section, we would support that risk summary statement, and that was removed too, the data support, not the risk summary statement. And there were also some changes to terminology versus what was in the draft guidance. So I'm hoping that as the draft guidance is finalized, some of this could be resolved over time or just get more consistent feedback. From a miscellaneous perspective, there were some cases where we didn't change content of the labeling text, but FDA did request the original study reports because they couldn't easily access them. So we were able to submit those. And then, as you know, a labeling person, when you submit a label, you open review to the entire label, all sections. So we did get comments on other sections of the label. I think this is in the vein of continuous improvement, and it's a good thing, but it does take more time to address those questions and kind of maybe loop in other people that were functional experts for those sections where comments arose. Some challenges. I alluded to the education and training needed. That's really an ongoing process. It has been for us because team members don't often work on multiple products, and then you also have people coming in and leaving teams all the time. So it seemed like every time we kicked off a meeting, no one really knew about PLLR, and we had to kind of educate the team again. And because of that, there's a lot of time-consuming work involved, not only with the searches of published literature and internal databases, but then our functional experts having to review all that information. Some indications have a lot more information than others. So it was obviously an easier review when it was an indication with little information. But the whole goal, obviously, is to put, see what's out there and put in appropriate information. Mapping out historical content for these really older labels, it was difficult to sometimes find where these conclusions came from, where the exposure calculations, how those came to be. That took a little bit of time. And then sometimes there were differing interpretations of data. Internally, in the GSK discussion, we would pull up an old clinical study report, and it wouldn't necessarily match what was in the approved label in terms of content. And we were successful on several occasions with updating the content and supporting that to FDA based on the study report. So it's just a matter of those discussions happened years ago, and we took the opportunity to kind of have those discussions again. And then obviously, I mentioned before, sponsor versus FDA. FDA has stricken out a lot of the language, I think just because the quality has to be there in terms of the data. And I think also, too, that streamlines the information and makes it easier to read as well. Lack of resource to assign projects. So these older products, there's not a lot of activity on an ongoing basis. And so we really had to make sure we had resource assigned and go to upper management and be like, we don't have anyone here, we need to assign someone. It's not an option, it's a requirement, and we need your help with that. I do know from just hearing from other sponsors, we did not outsource work, but I know that resource was an issue for other sponsors, and they have outsourced the work, they've outsourced the searching, and then they've also outsourced the updates themselves. We were able to keep that in-house with our group. So my last two slides are on learnings and just things I want to highlight. Timeline development for the portfolio is key. Depending on how many products you have in the portfolio, you really need to stagger it out. I'm not suggesting do it by quarter. I'm not sure, or by month, how you want to do it, but we just really could not do it all in those June timeframes. And then internal discussions should start well before the target date, either the required submission or the staggered internal submission that we had agreed. That needs to be laid out on the calendar, and we need to hold people accountable for that to make sure we can get it all done. The reevaluation of older data did generate a lot of questions, as I mentioned before, questioning CSR study or study report conclusions and just where the calculations came from. I think it, again, it's in the context of improving the label, and so we had to figure these things out to get the right information in the label. And then company core safety information may be impacted. We only had a handful of those GDSs or global data sheets impacted, but the point is you have to make that assessment with each update. And finally, it appears the thinking is still evolving with experience gained. Like most things, I think that over time you just have more learning and then you can apply that. We're hopeful that changes to the final guidance will help clarify. I know that FDA is actively collecting that feedback. I don't think the timing of when the final guidance will be issued yet, and it may take some time, but that just gives us more learning time to then implement those changes. And overall, I think we've gotten better at doing PLLR over time. I know internally we've gotten better evaluating the data. We've certainly gotten better at creating supporting documents to submit to FDA. And for us, it's progress, not perfection, and I feel like we've made a lot of progress. So that concludes my talk, and I think we'll have the Q&A session now. I don't know if you need that.
All right. Wonderful presentation, and I saw a whole bunch of questions line up online. So we'll go ahead and get started in those in just a second. For those of you in the room who have any questions, you know the drill of lining up at the two microphones. For my panelists, you can either just turn those on, leave your microphones on,
Okay.
whichever you All right, let's go ahead and start with the first online question, please.
Can you hear me? Okay. To submit the requested review and summary of all available published literature regarding the use of the drug product of interest in pregnant and lactating women, should a sponsor submit detailed search strategies, i.e. search terms, databases used, number of articles retrieved, if a subset of the articles were chosen and discussed in the sponsor's summary, should the sponsor outline the criteria for exclusion?
Answer that. So we would like the sponsor to provide us with their search strategies that they use, the years that they looked at in particular, what their search terms were, for example, the name of the drug and pregnancy, and fetal malformations, miscarriage. Those are the different things we would like for them to look at when they are doing their searches.
Okay, and again, if there's any questions in the room, step on up. But otherwise, let's go ahead with our next online question, please.
Okay. Is PLLR required for drugs approved in men only?
So the question is PLLR required for drugs approved in men only? That's an insightful question. PLLR affects every drug labeling, regardless of whether it is intended for a male population or not. Now, there are some further considerations when you are dealing with a drug for male populations, and you can provide some further information within your submission outlining a rationale for why you think certain things should be present or not. It is important to consider if the drug is being used in other ways in women. But there may be some accommodation as long as you provide your rationale and approach to your labeling. The division can look through that and review and consider how best to put forward the information for that specific population.
Okay, first question in the room, please step right up.
So Tracy, I really like the idea of the guide that you put together, the document to support the data. Is this on? So if this isn't an original NDA submission and you're submitting the labeling for the FDA reviewers, is that a preferred format to have a separate document, or can you address this in 274 or an ISS and then cross-reference it, maybe provide like a reviewer's guide for the PLLR section of the labeling?
Can you hear me? I can comment from an industry perspective. So that template that we developed was for older products that we converted. For the newer products, we've addressed the safety information in Module 274 under the safety or the pregnancy subsections of that document. I don't know if that's okay for FDA, but that's how we've been handling it.
And that's a perfectly reasonable way to handle, especially for new drug where there's not a lot of information.
Okay, the next question is directed to Dr. Liedtka. You mentioned that sponsors should include an interim report from an ongoing pregnancy registry. Do you also recommend that information from the registry be included in the label? For example, miscarriage percentages, birth defects, etc.
We do generally, with a pregnancy registry where it's been ongoing for long enough that there is a reasonable amount of information, include that in the label. An example would be some of the HIV drugs that have been PLLR converted, include information from the pregnancy registry. There have certainly also been instances where there isn't enough information yet to make it reasonable to include it.
Okay, let's go on to our next online question, please.
Okay, the next question is directed to Dr. Johnson. It says you mentioned to use the most recent efficacy supplement instead of the initial FDA approval date to calculate the PLLR submission due date. We had gotten FDA feedback in early 2015 to use the initial FDA approval date for labels in PLR format. Can you please clarify?
Thank you very much for that question. Just as the process of converting to PLLR has evolved, we have taken another look at where that initial guidance was to use the first efficacy supplement. Looking at it, we're trying to make sure that our approach is consistent to the way that we had also applied for the physician's labeling rule conversion. And so in that sense, if you have a drug approved after June 30th, 2001, and you have multiple efficacy supplements, you would want to look at the efficacy supplement that triggers the earliest submission date. So that is the current approach. So when you start looking over your portfolio, please keep that in mind. We're looking for the earliest submission date.
Okay, next online question, please.
Okay. Does the FDA have a list of converted PLLR labels or model PLLR labels available?
Leigh, would you like to respond?
So we don't have, a list that's publicly available, but the labelings are available at Drugs at FDA. So you can look up that information, but we don't have a list available that we can share.
I think Dr. Johnson said there's.
So also, if you receive the new drug approval, RSS, you can also find anything anything that's being approved will be in PLLR, but otherwise do reference the other sources of information, Daily Med or was there anyone FDA label? You can find all of the examples out there, and particularly pay attention to ones that may be of your similar drug class, so you can kind of understand how the review division's approach to the PLLR conversion goes.
FDA label does have a button that allows you to pick PLLR versus, or PLR versus old format, but not PLLR.
I know from an industry perspective, we've used other databases to search, and we will put in 8.2 lactation to identify the PLLR labels since it was nursing mothers before, and that's aided us finding those approved labels.
Thank you, Tracy. That is what we do with FDA label. It's a full text search, and 8.2 lactation works to pull the PLLR labels. Thank you.
And again, we've got about 10 minutes left for questions. If you've got questions in the room, come on up to the microphone. But let's take our next online question.
Okay, the next question is actually a couple of questions about generics and asking if generic labeling needs to comply or have PLLR labeling submitted. In particular, asking how do ANDA holders obtain notification of a labeling update for PLLR? Do they go to Daily Med? So just addressing the issue of generics and PLLR.
That's a good question, because the generics, as we're centered here in the Office of New Drugs, we deal with the innovator products, and generics usually follow what has been done to the innovator labeling. So as far as the conversions, we are not specifically tracking the generic labeling conversions, but do realize that they would follow on the innovator. And I think Eric Brodsky may have an additional point here.
I agree with Dr. Johnson. This is Eric Brodsky, FDA. So as we know, the ANDA labeling must follow the RLD labeling, except for permissible differences like changes in manufacturing, ingredient information, changes due to patent or exclusivity, or potentially changes due to suitability petitions. So if the RLD NDA has PLLR labeling, the ANDA, associated ANDA labeling, must also have PLLR labeling. If the RLD NDA does not have PLLR labeling, the associated ANDA cannot have PLLR labeling. With respect to what sources ANDA application holders can find updated NDA RLD labeling, that's a good question. FDA is talking internally about that, about giving specific. We've had recent ANDA guidances released. However, we haven't been so specific about what sources but we're talking internally about that, and hopefully we can get you that information. Thank you.
All right, next online question, please.
Okay. Can old labeling be converted into PLLR without changing them into PLR?
Right, so can old labeling be converted into PLLR without converting to the physician labeling rule?
I think it's asking, can you have PLLR without PLR?
Yeah, so the understanding, the first thing to understand is that PLLR is a component of the physician's labeling rule. You know, it was deferred when the physician's labeling rule first came through because of continued discussion on the sections for pregnancy and lactation. So now it has come through, and that's just the final piece of the pie for the whole physician labeling rule. So you cannot have PLLR content and formatting in absence of the physician labeling rule format. But I do want to say that for the old labeling, there is the requirement under PLLR to remove the pregnancy letter category. So that is what old labeling should do, is remove the pregnancy letter category. In that as well, I do want to encourage those folks with the older labeling to think about whether or not your label is up to date. Does it have you know, the most recent safety information concerning the drug, or do you need to further think about some updates to the label?
All right, next online question, please.
Okay, do we need to include teratogenic effect under pregnancy category when RLD does not state the same? I think we've already, I don't know if we've answered that question. But.
Next online question? Or go ahead. Was it answered or was it not? I didn't follow that.
You want me to repeat it? So it's asking about needing to include teratogenic effect under the pregnancy category when the RLD doesn't state the same. Not
Sure that I understand the question. The old labeling would only need to require the pregnancy category removal.
I think we may have answered the question with Eric's, Dr. Brodsky's answer.
Okay.
And again, if there's any questions in the room, come on up to the mic. We got 4 minutes left. Do we have more online questions back there? Okay, please go ahead.
Have you seen any impact in the clinical practice regarding the elimination of the drugs categories? Or I should say probably pregnancy categories.
Just clarify, so have we seen any effects of not having the drug categories?
That's what I think it's asking. I think it's asking for, it says any impact in clinical practice. I think it's asking if we are aware of any impact.
Okay. Anyone? You know, as far as you know, from the DPMH perspective, we go out to professional conferences and we hear some feedback, and I think it's folks are trying to learn how to adjust to this change. And you know, the more they learn and understand how the information is going to come forward, and the real intent is to provide a better description of the data and information that leads to the ultimate conclusion. It's here to improve and assist with decision making. So I think we're in a period of adjustment right now, and I don't think I could answer that more specifically. Okay. So we will have to continue to watch and see and seek out other ways that we can get some physician feedback. Thank you.
Okay, have we got another online question, please?
Looking through. Okay, It's a question regarding the supportive document in Module 1. Should it be under 1.17 or another location? I think this is from Dr. Liedtka's talk.
The only specification is that it be in Module 1. You could determine where it may be best suited, and as answered previously, you can also provide a link if you're placing the information in section 2.7.4 or such.
Okay, and it looks like our last question is going to come from here in the room. Please go
Last
ahead,
one.
sir.
Okay. I'm just curious from the FDA's perspective. I know that you don't have class labeling per se in this space, but beginning to get some experience under our belts, and we talked about how some sections might be removed, or the HIV example is a good one where could be looked at as class. Oh, you want to comment anything about those kinds of patterns, and maybe also have you seen any updates yet to PLLR that was submitted and then new data coming in?
So I could probably answer the.
I'm going to defer to you guys.
So can you repeat the first part of the question once more? I'll answer the first part of it.
Yeah, I'm sorry. The first part was about what kind of patterns you've seen. So in other words, we talked about the HIV and lactation. That's so kind of probing a little bit for like areas where there might be class issues. You know, not asking for the text, but just kind of a yes, no. You've seen things like HIV is one example. I know CDER is not here, but I've seen a very strong pattern for pediatric vaccines as an example, where things may not be applicable and so on. So any comment you want to make in that area?
Yeah, we have been doing it. We've done diabetes products recently, so we've developed some class language under clinical considerations, the background risk statement. We've done extensive research where we've been able to develop background risks related to diabetes population, so we've done that for those products. Asthma was mentioned as well. There's a specific clinical consideration for asthma. HIV, as you mentioned. So we have included information based on certain disease populations that we've seen.
And the second part of the question was just whether you've seen any updates to a something that's already been submitted as PLLR, and then maybe, I would imagine, a new closure of a pregnancy registry or something that then changes what's already been approved.
Thank you very much for that question. So when you do have your new PLLR labeling and it has come out, but then you find later that there's some additional safety information that you want to provide an update, really think about the message of what that additional information is. Certainly a pregnancy registry we want to see and review, because those are really our best prospective studies in trying to gather information. But when you look at the literature and continuing studies on the particular drug used during pregnancy or during lactation, really consider if it's going to change your message in the labeling. Is it going to change the risk message? And if so, then you would work with that and provide for a labeling supplement to update the language. So we have no specific time period that we're saying you need to update the labeling, but do keep an eye on what's going on in the scientific literature and even within your own work, so that when there is a new concern, that it is reflected. Additionally, I just wanted to mention that there may be some slight evolution in language as we move through. You may have seen, as even in our background risk statement from the very early 2015, we had a statement, it has been finessed and revised. So there's slight modifications that may be occurring over time. We're hoping that that's becoming less and less as we develop a more consistent process. As I mentioned in my presentation, we are still working through comments with the draft PLLR guidance. Our intent is to provide some more information, especially as Dr. Liedtka provided some examples for section 8.3. We will expand on that section, which is very minuscule right now in the current guidance, and then some address some other comments that have been raised through from the initial commentary to the draft guidance. Any other points from our speakers?